Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week I'm going to be fixing this smashed derailleur. This bike has broken the chain when it's out on the ride. That has cut through this derailleur. It's frayed off all the cable, it's kinked this cable, and this could be a really big job. This could entail new brake pipes, it could involve taking out the bottom bracket. All the cables and pipes go through the headset bearing, so we're going to need to drop the front forks and get these through the handlebars as well. Potentially new bar tape. It could really escalate as a job. So we're going to see how this one goes and let's get started. So the first thing I need to do is obviously begin to dismantle the bike. I'm going to cut this cable nice and short because we're going to take the inner away from the outer through the frame. I'm going to take off all the little fittings that are on the end here. I had to cut that a little bit short to actually get them off where it had been really chewed up on the bike from this poor shift and this broken derailleur. I'm going to remove the original derailleur from the frame. The reason I'm going to do that is I do need to check the alignment of the derailleur hanger, and then you can see here how this derailleur has broken in half. There's actually a couple of pivots through here and they actually fit into a plastic fitting which is sort of between the two alloy parts, and that chain is literally sliced through that plastic fitting here. You can see here, probably 3D printed in some way, but that is actually literally cut in half, so you can see there the damage, and that's what we're actually putting right. So I'm going to put on a derailleur alignment tool here. I'm using the valve because I did notice that the wheel was a little bit out of true, so that's something else I need to deal with, but I'm just using the valve area to make sure that everything is alignment. And amazingly, the derailleur hanger itself was absolutely 100% aligned, so there was no damage to the derailleur hanger, which is obviously one of the things that does usually get damaged when a derailleur gets damaged the way this one had. I'm going to remove the wheels. I've removed the front because I'm going to actually be moving the brake caliper, and a little bit of housekeeping on this one. Initially I'm going to take the cassette off. At this point I'm just assuming I need to degrease the cassette and maybe do a bit of wheel alignment. You can see here how the grease has built up on that cassette, and we need to clean that off and make sure that's all nice and clean when it goes back on the bike. Now I'm going to remove the inner of the rear derailleur cable here, so we'll just pull that through the bike. At this stage I'm aware that the outer runs right the way through the bike, so I'm going to also remove the handlebar tape here. This will just give me a little bit more room where they route through the handlebars, so I haven't got that final turn here into the shifter itself. So I'm going to actually relieve the pressure and tension on that cable there, and that's one less bend to deal with when I'm pulling through the new outer. I'm going to just put a little fitting inside the brake there to stop those pads coming together if I accidentally pull the brake. And now I'm going to remove the caliper because I'm actually going to drop these forks, and that will allow that caliper to lift up through the forks, through the hole with the original brake pipe, with hopefully not disturbing it. At this stage I'm not sure whether I'm going to need to bleed the brakes or remove those, but we start working out those forks to give us the room to put in the new cable. Off comes the stem, a few spaces there that actually disconnect completely, so we can put those to one side and really work that down so that we can see where the cable is going inside the headset bearing. It actually runs down the center of the headset bearing. But also when I'm doing that, I noticed here the compression fitting for the forks had risen out of the forks, so we need to make sure that that's absolutely where it needs to be. So I just did this as a little bit of general servicing as I was doing the bike, so I torqued that up to make sure that when we do put it back together that's not forgotten, and that is now absolutely spot on. Now at this stage I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm going to run the cable guide that I've got here. I'm going to be pulling the cable up through the frame, so I'm thinking I'll put this through the handlebars here and then work that down through to the rear derailleur. So I start to pull this here, you can see, and I'm having an awful problem there. Nothing seems to be moving, so I gave myself a little bit of slack here through the handlebars by removing that outer through the handlebars. Started to go down, but for some reason it was not going into the frame, and I began to realize that actually the reason for that was there was a foam outer over this cable, and that foam outer wouldn't slide through the hole at the bottom of the frame. Internal routed cables are never ever straightforward, and this was just an example of something that can pop up and cause problems along the way. So I'm going to have to change my tactic here and pull the cable the other way through the frame. So I'm going to put the fresh outer through the handlebar and then work it the opposite way. So the cable guide I'm going to bring from the derailleur end up to the handlebars. So I'll get that through the handlebars first. It has to go round 2 tight corners here, up through the stem, and then a right angle through to the right hand shifter. So we work that through. You can see how fiddly this is, how sped up this is. Very, very fiddly work, very difficult to film. We've got the outer now through the handlebars. So I'm now going to use this cable guide at the other end of the bike rather than this end. So I've disconnected that now, and then I can go down to the other end and put the cable guide on, and I'm going to feed it through the opposite way. So you can see now that foam appearing, and that was what was stopping me pulling the cable through, because it was bunching in the frame. So we've now got the outer fully out and a guide in the frame here to bring the new one through. So you can see here, this is the foam. It actually had what appeared to be either a cut or a tear in the center of it, and I think that was where it was bunching up and causing me issues when I was trying to remove it. So we're going to replace this with a solid piece of foam. I'm not, like say, sure at this stage whether that's just a tear or whether it was a 2-piece section in there, but we're going to use a complete one. This actually stops the cable outer from tapping and rattling in the down tube. That's why we use these foams inside the frame, just to stop any noises that we don't obviously want on a lovely bike like this. So in goes the cable guide into the new outer. We put the foam on that as well, and now I can pull it through from the derailleur end rather than the opposite way that I was planning on doing the job. So that's now working its way through. I'm happy, you can see it's come through at the other end, and I've left that quite long so that I can get all the lengths and everything correct when I cut it, because it's literally a one cut option on this. Now we're putting the headset on. There's actually a spacer that runs through the top bearing, and you have to get the cables and all the outers through that space in that compression fitting. Very, very fiddly. It took us 2 or 3 attempts actually to get this right, even for the filming, but we managed to get that in, and you can see there we can now begin to put the pre-tension on the headset bearing, and everything is now where it needs to be. So quite relieved at this stage. It's always a heartwarming moment when you finally get that outer cable through and you know you're on the way to getting the new cable in. It's very, very tricky if it goes wrong. On goes the front caliper, putting that back on. So we've obviously had to disturb that in order to get the forks to drop. So once the wheel's back in, I'll adjust the brakes and check everything there as well. So that's now in, and now we can put the new inner cable in. Now straight away I wanted to check that this cable was smooth in the outer, so at this point I fitted the new rear derailleur to check it, and somehow in the heat of it all we actually forgot to film that going on, but we now have the new derailleur on and working. And now I can just refit the original handlebar tape. There was no need to replace this, it went back on the bike okay, so I can just retape the end, and then everything there is smooth and nice as it was originally. So we just cut that little end off there, and now we can turn our attention to the wheel. So the wheel was actually what took this bike from being just a fiddly cable to a mega job. As you can see, the chain had actually dropped behind the cassette and sliced the spokes. So now we need to order new spokes and rebuild this wheel, which unfortunately for the customer was a surprise we didn't initially spot. And then it got worse. As you can see, the nipples were splitting and disintegrating, which means that this isn't going to be just a straightforward swap. So I did have the right size nipples in stock, but the corrosion made them a nightmare to swap over as they just turned to powder. But as you can see, this wheel is waiting to collapse as it is, so it's got to be done. Nipples on this wheel as well. So in order to do that, this is where this job is now escalating. I originally thought I was just going to retension the wheel. I wouldn't have needed to take the tyre off to do that, but now we need to take the tyre and the tube off of this bike so that we can get to the nipples from the back where they go into the wheel. So off comes the tyre. Then I will also need to remove the rim tape here, which is a self-adhesive. These are actually set up for if we want to convert this bike to tubeless tyres. Thankfully for us, he had the inner tubes in there, because we would have now had the mess of the tubeless sealant. At this stage, I have now put in the brand new spokes. So we ordered new spokes for this one on that drive side and replaced all the nipples. And then I'm just checking that all the tensions are correct around this wheel. This actually took me over an hour just to relace the wheel, and then the time taken for retensioning it. So That's why we've just got a little short snippet here of the retention in the final stages of this wheel. Everything here is now absolutely spot on, and I'm very, very pleased with this wheel. It was actually quite a way out, the actual trueness, but you can see here, these are the spokes that we've removed and replaced. You can see how when you release the tension on them, they're twisted, where that chain has actually dragged them and bent them, where it's done that damage to them, especially this one. You can see how that's kinked in several places, but when the tension's on them, they look straight to the eye, but these would have failed very, very quickly if this bike had been ridden the way it was. And again here you can see the nipples that we replaced, all chipped and damaged on one side, but the two on the right hand side there were actually damaged on the inside where you put the tool on there, a square head for initially putting them into the bike. So that was corrosion rather than damage from the accident. So we're really maintained these wheels by doing this work. On goes the new self-adhesive rim tape. We're using a DT Swiss tape here, so we just nip that off. Then we can actually put a little hole in those for the new valve and then replace the tyre or refit the tyre. So on goes that tyre. We're lining up the logo with the valve hole, same as on the front wheel, and then in goes that inner tube. And like I say, I was actually glad that he wasn't running this tubeless, because it would have made an awful mess and would have been another expense that he didn't really need. Inflate that tyre, good pressure into the tyre. We've now got a structurally sound wheel, and everything at this stage we're assuming is going well, but as you'll see towards the end of the video, we hit another problem with this wheel that we didn't realise until the very final stages of doing this work on the bike. So I'm going to wash the wheel down, because obviously I've handled it, it's been trued and the spoke work and everything else has all been done to this, so I'm just washing this down, blissfully unaware of what's about to happen with this wheel when we finally get towards the final stages of the bike. And then I'm also going to put the cassette through the ultrasonic cleaner. It was quite grimy, it had that thick grease on it, and again it's just about presenting the bike nicely after all this work has been done. So we want a nice clean cassette on the bike. So you can see there, through the ultrasonic cleaner, wash it down in warm soapy water, dry each of these cogs off with a microfiber towel, make sure there's no residue on them so that they are absolutely spotless when we give the bike back to the customer. Everything there is now looking good, and then I can just grease this hub before putting the cassette onto it. Occasionally cassettes corrode onto the hubs and become very hard to take off in some cases, so I'm just future proofing it with that grease. And now I torque that up once again to make sure that it comes off easily next time. And I will also lubricate the through axle, because again I've cleaned this off, so our general purpose grease and then our anti-seize grease on the threads. We'll work that in before we put the wheel back on. We did that with both front and rear skewers. On goes the wheels now. I had to let out some of the tyre pressure to get it back into the frame, as it was a very tight fit. And then the next stage for me is to actually put in that brand new cable, and you can see that new derailleur on there, which as I mentioned we forgot to film putting on. And then I'm also going to cut the tail off of this, so we just snip that off and put a tail end on there to stop that fraying. We don't want that fraying off. I also noticed the front derailleur was actually not routed correctly, the cable. It should actually be sitting under the fitting of this, so it's sitting across the top. So you can see there I'm just routing it underneath. And then there was just a little bit of adjustment I needed to do on this one in the high position. There's actually a couple of lines on the side of these derailleurs and they weren't aligned correctly, so I wound in that little adjuster to get that correct as well. So it's just a bit of housekeeping really on the bike there as well. Got brand new chain going on there. The bike arrived without a chain on it, so we've sized that chain already. I've cut that to the correct size for the gearing and the length of the chainstay that we have on that bike. We lock that off, and now we can begin to adjust the gears. Initially I go up to gear 1. I needed to adjust the low screw on this. Obviously this is fresh out the box, so we need to do the adjustments. Make sure that goes into gear 1, and now the jockey wheels are actually running against gear 1, so I need to do a bit of beard screw adjustment, which is what I'm now doing there to bring the jockey wheels away from that first gear, and everything there is now adjusted absolutely spot on that rear. But then we notice this. Note those pedals are still turning. That means that the free hub is dragging and needs to be serviced. So we were about to be finished when we uncovered yet another problem on this bike. This dragging and bouncing of the chain could have even been the reason the chain dropped off and snapped in the first place. But of course it came in without that chain on, so we had no idea it was dragging until this moment. So I've took the cassette off, took the disc rotor off, and I'm going to remove the hub body from the wheel and give that a service as well. It's mainly down to the hub, not free flowing when it's in its neutral position. So you can see here how thick the grease is on that. So I'm going to clean all these greases off and then re-lubricate this. So these are the pawls and their springs which we're removing. We need to clean those up, so they come out first. But there is this little rubber ring here which we're actually going to use our silicone grease on, so that's now all ready for a cleanup. So I'm using one of our detailing brushes here and a degreaser. I didn't want to be too heavy-handed here and wash the bearings out in the hub. I'm using a minimal degreaser and spraying it onto a brush rather than onto the hub, and then I'm drying it off with a microfiber towel, which as you can see has left it nice and spotless. I'm going to clean off the pawls and this rubber O-ring. It was actually this O-ring that was causing this dragging rather than the pawls themselves. Although they did need servicing, the rubber O-ring was gripping the hub itself, and that was what was causing this not to be so free flowing. So clean that off first. They're all ready to go back on, and then I've also just got clean inside the hub. I don't want to get this too wet because I don't want to get any degreaser in through the seal on the bearings. So I'm being a little bit tactile here with the way I'm cleaning this to make sure we don't wash out those bearings in any way, and you can see the bearings sitting in there. Now this is the rubber ring that I felt was causing most of that issue, and I'm going to use our silicone grease here just to lubricate that rubber itself. It's one of the few times we use the silicone grease is on these rubbers and on rubbers that cover bearings and such like. So worth checking out our website for the grease selection that we do sell on our website. Same with this freehub grease, the Shimano freehub grease. We also sell this on our website, so do check out the link in the description below. On goes the springs and the pawls now. We'll do these one at a time. You can see the difference in those, how clean they are now and how everything is now beginning to flow and look nice on this hub. So if it looks nice, you know it's going to operate nicely as well once it's back on the bike. A little bit of freehub grease there on the pawls themselves to help those when they're actuating, and then we can slide this back onto the bike. Going from a snap chain to a hub service shows you just how much these jobs can escalate and how the little problems can all add up to one big catastrophe. But there we are, and that's the hub service complete. On goes the disc rotor itself, so we lock that back off, and again we'll torque that up, and then we'll put the cassette back on and torque that as well. So once we go through the gears, we can check everything again is in alignment and adjusted correctly. Everything's good there, and you'll see as I stop the pedals, they're now not turning on themselves. So the hub now is operating correctly, nice and smoothly, not grabbing that wheel and turning those pedals. Obviously we've had everything apart, so now we need to torque everything and make sure everything is safe. So we've done the through axle on the front and the front caliper, and obviously the rear axle and then the rear derailleur. It was certainly a stressful job, but that's now all the work completed. So that's this lovely Ribble now sorted out, and it really shows you how these jobs can be quite dynamic and fluid as you're doing them. It's not often what you see at face value that is the actual essence of the job. Obviously with the extra wheel and hub work, there was quite a bit more to this bike than met the initial eye. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please do like the video. It's a great way of helping us as a channel to get the video out there to more people to see it. And if you've enjoyed it and want to see more like this, then hit the subscribe button. And if you want to help us really out as a channel, check out the link in the description below to our own website. We package all the parcels and get them out to you, and it's a great way of supporting me and Simon. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.